This is basically all on identification of these species to get you introduced to them in case you're not familiar with some of these species as we go through. As we've talked about with all of the programs right now, all forage, gravel, and mulch programs will all work off of the same prohibited weed species list. So you will be certifying on these species plus your local noxious weed list in your state. And if you have additional ones for each county or province, basically you're looking for all your weeds. There have been some questions as to what if there's something else, cheatgrass or a weed in hay that is important, foxtail barley, which is not on our list, but we know can cause abscesses or problems with horses or other livestock eating it. What I do in that case is that's the great opportunity why you can write on the comments line, these other species were detected. We've had cases where we've had maybe other poisonous plants in the field. We're not certifying to the quality or the lack of those plants, but you would note that species on your list. And then the end user knows, oh, geez, there's this plant in this field, or we know there's these weeds in the area or within the field. So just something else to look at. So as we move through the presentation, the easiest way for me to organize this was alphabetical. And so we're going to start at the top, and in the next hour and a half-ish, we'll work through all of these species. It's basically just a photo slideshow with some helpful identification bullet points. So starting off, so this is absinthe wormwood. It's in the same family with most of our sages, Artemisia. It's a perennial plant, can grow rather tall, 16 to 48 inches, has large dissected leaves that are 1 inch to about 3 inches long. To me, this is a very easy plant to identify because we have a lot of sagebrush in our area, so we're dealing with that. Hopefully everyone will understand the terminology that I'm using. I am more trained in botany, so I'll try to use or explain the terms that I'm using as I go through. But if you have any questions, feel free to put those in there. So you can see the very dissected, kind of a frosty green color that the leaves are on absinthe wormwood. It grows erect with multiple stems, and it does have a fairly indescript flower, multiple flowers on the head. So that's a quick overview of absinthe wormwood for those that are dealing with that in your area. So this is Austrian fieldcress. This is one of the newer species that we've added. In Wyoming, it's an early detection rapid response species. It's a perennial, very aggressive mustard. Its leaves are alternate and toothed, and some of the very basal leaves can be lobed. The flowers are four-petalled, as all mustards are, and they are bright yellow in color. The flowers are borne in the axils of the stems and leaves. It has a deep creeping root system with basically this species, I'll show you some pictures, but it's very much like the root system of leafy spurge or Canada thistle. It's just a mustard, or perennial purple weed if you're familiar with that one. It's found in wet areas. In our areas, it can grow in the almost semi-aquatic in the bottom of ditches, and it's a really challenging species to deal with in our sub-irrigated meadows, in my county at least. So here's a few photos of it. Really small, four-petaled flower. You can see the toothed leaves. They have a more olivey kind of green color to them. And at the bottom, you can see a plant we pulled out of the bottom of a ditch with multiple buds along that creeping root system, adventitious root system. It produces tiny mustard seeds, and you can see some of the places that we'll grow it. We just actually managed this species for our county. Follow-up treatments 2 days ago with our nice weather. Plants look more like rosettes, as you can see in the picture where it's found in the bottom of the ditch this late in the fall, but really challenging to manage. I hope most of you are not dealing with this plant. Okay, on to black henbane. Black henbane is a biennial or annual plant, depending on the weather conditions, soil moisture and temperature mostly. The entire plant is covered with kind of a sticky hair. It's called a glabrous hair, so it's a hair with a glob of sap kind of stuff on the end. The flowers are actually quite beautiful. They're cream colored with purple center and purple veins, very unique. It's in the Solanaceae family, so it's in the same family as potatoes, tomatoes, are nightshades, and the seeds are produced in these tiny base or pineapple shaped capsules that will break open, and it can distribute hundreds of thousands of seeds depending on the size of the plant. Main reason this plant was added, as some of you that deal with it are familiar with, it's very toxic to livestock. It's very toxic to all life forms, actually humans as well. We tend to find it in our hay meadows if a ditch was worked and maybe somebody didn't clean their equipment, or if there's a bared off area, if somebody's doing some field work. It almost always needs disturbance to be introduced. So a couple photos, you can see those base or pineapple shaped seed capsules. Below that, you can see how they dry and tan, and then the seeds will shake out. It almost makes a shaky sound if you are around those. The cream colored flowers with the purple veins, and you can see in that close-up picture all the hairs that are on that plant. Typically it is avoided by grazers. It's not very palatable, of course, because it's poisonous, but the hairs and it has a very stinky smell, so it's typically avoided unless animals are put in captivity. If somebody happens to be moving some livestock, or if you run a yearling operation, sometimes that can be troublesome there. And then at the bottom, I think it looks like a really wavy leaf margin, and the leaves have a light colored or almost white center vein. Here's a couple populations I've dealt with in my career. This was a pipeline that went in, this is pipeline corridor, and the year before this was undisturbed, and just that disturbance allowed this crop of little kinbing trees to come up. You can see the skeletons, often, looking for skeletons or the last year's spent flowers or plants. It's pretty helpful in being able to find green or young rosettes. So just a couple examples of what that plant looks like. On the photo with the green plants, since I don't have a pointer, those plants are about 5 feet tall. They were nearly as tall as I am, and they were annuals that year. We had a big moisture year, and all those plants came up on an energy pipeline. So buffalo burr, this is a species I have actually been finding more and more in my area. It's typically associated with cropping areas, but we've been finding it more along roadsides and things like that. Buffalo burr is also in the nightshade family. It is an annual plant. As you can see, its leaves are deeply lobed with lots and lots of spines on them. The spines are on the stem, on the backside of the leaves, all over the flowering stalk, the pedicel and the peduncle of the flower as it's growing. The flowers are bright yellow, and the seed has a spine-covered capsule as well. So very spiny. A couple photos of what that looks like. It's very green leafed, and I didn't have a really good picture of the leaves on the backside, but the mid vein and even the veins on the lobe part of the leaf have spines coming off those. So not something you want to touch with the bare hand. You can see the spininess of the capsules and the entire petals on the flower, so bright yellow in color. So that was buffalo burr. Next is Canada thistle, which almost everybody, whether we're Eastern and Western, are familiar with this species. It's pretty much throughout the United States. It is a perennial species. Its roots are extensive and creeping, allowing for this plant to reproduce vegetatively. Their plants are both male or female, and the flowers are the bract that subtends the petals. So there's and a lot of the things in the tribe of thistles or in the Asteraceae family, true to knapweeds as well, have a ball of bracts with the petals coming out. So it's a ball of bracts subtending the petals. And in this case, they're small with some spines on them. Flowers then can be pink, violet, all the way to a dark purple, and in my area we even see them really light pink to cream colored. Of course, in our fields when we're certifying, at least in my area, we're certifying most of the time before they bloom because we're high elevation and it's cold here, so we'll be looking for the vegetative portion. In that case, the leaves are relatively narrow in the world of thistles, about 1 inch wide, with thorns or prickles all over them, really green, and usually you find more than one in a disturbance area. We see these thistles can really grow anywhere, but it does like water or disturbance. And so one of the photos here shows it's in the Asteraceae family. It has a plumed seed, so it blows in the wind and disturbance that way. Most people are pretty familiar with Canada thistle. It can grow up to about 3.5 feet tall, but its flowers are small, about the size of a nickel, never bigger than a quarter, and relatively small prickles on the bracts of the Canada thistle. So this is a species I have not actually ever seen. It was added, this is one of the most recent additions to the NAISMA list. This is Caucasian blue stem. It's an invasive blue stem that we have mostly, to my understanding, eastern Kansas, some in Nebraska, some up north into Dakotas, and I believe southern as well. It has a small blue-gray, it's a small blue-gray warm season bunch grass with flowering stems that can be 1 to 3 feet tall. It forms dense tufts with smooth leaf blades, so relatively smooth the touch, and up to 12 inches long with a thickened midvein, which is not that unique as far as blue stems go. The stem joints are purpley tinged and may be smooth, or you can see in the photo there's some hairs there. It tends to bloom in late June to July, far earlier than native blue stems, so that can help you in just the timing and division of those species. And the flower head featured side branches, so there'll be a main branch and then a side flowering branch as well, which resembles more like what Johnson grass looks like, some of the other species we're maybe more familiar with. And it turns straw colored or really light colored in the fall, instead of the dark purpley red that the native blue stems tend to change to with colder temperatures. So here's the background. There is the invasion, how it turns straw colored with the native vegetation around it. You can see a blown up photo of what the actual flowering parts look like with hairs on them as well. There are probably other people that can maybe have seen or had live experiences with this. If you have that, there's folks on from Nebraska and Kansas or other states that are dealing with this plant. If there's other helpful hints that you know of, please put those in the chat box for the Caucasian blue stem. The next plant is common burdock, which is a biennial species. It tends to make a rosette the first year, grouping of leaves on the ground, and then as it gains nutrients and rootstock, it will shoot up a flowering stalk the second year. The leaves are fuzzy, dark green in color, and they have a heart shape at the base. The flowers are pretty inconspicuous, but they do have a little purpley color at their maximum bloom, which is they don't open up fully. And of course, the seed heads, in this case of burdock, have a Velcro-y spine, so they can attach and can be transported easily both by humans and animals. Couple photos of burdock. You can see, I've actually had people like, how do you tell it from rhubarb? It's hairy. Rhubarb's not really hairy. It does have this more of an aster-based family because it's in the Asteraceae family. You can see the burrs. The burrs are actually, while they're spined, if you were to have a pair of gloves on and squeeze them, they're soft. You can squish them. So we have some other bird species like wild licorice, which is more of a football shape. And if you were to try to squeeze it really hard, it's a really hard capsule and it doesn't squeeze. One of the ways you can look for burdock. Burdock almost always grows with disturbance in corrals, maybe in a stackyard or a irrigation ditch, or maybe on the sides of pivots where there's a little bit more disturbance. Relatively easy to control. Because it's a biennial, if you have a single plant, you can just chop it with a shovel, use some other cultural methods there. So common cupina, fortunately I have no experience with this plant besides looking at its pictures online. It is a winter annual that I know is a significant issue with our partners up in Washington and Oregon, and I think in parts of Idaho as well. The leaves are deeply toothed with margins containing short, stiff spines, and the flowers are pretty bright in color, pink, purple, lavender, depending on how you characterize that color. And the seeds are oblong and very distinctive with a ring of dark, stiff bristles encircling the end. So a couple photos of what these plants look like. Very divided leaves, a really interesting seedling with that dark, almost rust-colored midvein. And that midvein continues into the rosette form of the plant before it bolts. You can see the really divided leaves and the dark-colored midvein, which is pretty unique in a lot of the species we typically deal with. And then here at the bottom, you can see what it looks like after the flowers are spent. The flowers are not real showy, but they are bright in color. They're small and fairly delicate looking as far as a flower goes. A couple other photos I've borrowed from folks, both through invasive species websites and folks I've been able to borrow photos for. So you can see that almost lacy dissect leaf, for not sounding overly simple. It has this really weedy growth form where it really stands out to the eye. If you were to see a patch of that in a field, I think that texture would be very easy to identify to the eye. So that is common cupina. Here's common mullet, Verbascus thapsus. It is a biennial, forming a leafy rosette the first year and a flowering tall stalk the second year. Can be very tall, 7 foot tall in areas. Tends to like to grow in disturbance, gravel bars, places with disturbance in fields. Sometimes you have a meadow where the irrigation is not managed well, like you have a drier area where maybe some of the grasses are fading out. Sometimes you could get mold in those situations. The entire plant is extremely fuzzy. It's in the Scrophulaceae family, so it has a 5-petaled flower. I have a few close-ups of those in just a minute. And so they're 5-petaled, and the flowers sit directly on the stem, so there's no peduncle that is like this flowering stem. And they're bright yellow in color. They tend to be pretty easy and look very similar to identify as a skeleton as well. So here's a couple close-ups of what the flower looks like. The rosette, typically if you find one adult plant, you're going to find many rosettes, or a skeleton, you'll find many rosettes around that. You can see the fuzziness, the kind of frosty green color of the plants because of the pubescence that it has. Here's what a patch, or I call those mullein forests, look like. Those are 5 to 6 foot tall plants, and a lot of them there, produces a lot of seed, and a close-up of the flower. And you can see just at that scale how pubescent, almost woolly, that these plants are. So that's common mullein. Now we move on to common tansy. I was first introduced to back in 2006, actually, at the NAISMA meeting, or the NAMA meeting in Calgary, where it is, I guess, a urban invader there along their waterways on the rivers there. So common tansy is an ornamental release in most cases. It's a perennial flower that was planted at homesteads and old ranch homes in my area. The leaves are very dark green. It's very aromatic, or stinky in my opinion. The leaves not only are very dissect, but the leaf margin is also toothed. And you can see that in the picture there. The flowers only have disc flowers. They have no ray flowers, so the pretty whites that we typically see on daisies. We don't see those 2 different types of petals. We just have disc flowers in this case. It is used in some, like in some books, you can see it for homeopathic purposes, but then there's also instances, depending on how you use it and what concentration, where it could become toxic as well. Typically bothers a lot of people. It's really aromatic and bothers a lot of people allergies. But in these photos, all 4 of them actually, you can see the bright yellow, I call them, when I train my employees, a button-like flower. So just bright yellow in nature, and multiple flowers at the top of the plant, at the terminal inflorescence. And you can see the lacy leaves with the leaf margin being toothed as well here. A couple more shots of what those look. The one picture at the bottom with the river in the background, that was actually from Calgary. And the other one with kind of the logs in the back of it, that is taken at a blacksmith shop on the Pony Express pathway through Wyoming, where I used to work. That clump of tansy has probably been there for around 100 years and really hasn't invaded too far out because it's limited by water. But an interesting shot of how long that perennial can persist. So that's common tansy. Now we move on to Dalmatian toadflax, Linaria dalmatica. There are multiple toadflaxes, as we'll talk about later, but Dalmatian toadflax is a perennial. Its leaves are heart-shaped and clasp the stem. So the leaf actually clasps around the stem, forming a base like an arrowhead. The flowers are bright yellow in color and more of a 1-tone or 2-tone flower. And of course, it's a perennial and it has creeping roots. So it spreads a lot by creeping roots within meadows. In instances where I've dealt with this species invading meadows on my side of the state, it comes from the home site. It's another one of those flowers that's hard to educate folks about because it is quite beautiful. The flowers are pretty. On other side of the state where they're more of a grassland type, it seems to be able to spread thoroughly in the mixed grass prairie and the short grass prairie, to where it's a true rangeland invader there in those senses. It can invade the sagebrush systems as well. Here are a couple shots of it. You can see those heart-shaped, more of a frosty leaf. So in plant classification, leaves are gray or blue in color because they're either 1, covered by hairs or pubescent, or 2, because they have a waxy cuticle. And in the case of toadflax, it's because it has a waxy cuticle. So you can see that kind of blue-gray color in this situation. And then the toadflax is in the scroff family. It has a spur off of the back of the flower. There are many other species we deal with, maybe in our jobs, not so much in certifying hay, but columbines and larkspurs that are in the same family that have that spurred flower or a petal with a long extension off the bottom of it. So that is Dalmatian toadflax. It can, on certain summers with moisture, resprout in the fall, and that's what this photo is down here at the bottom. You can see the fall resprouting. That's a great opportunity to pass on to your producers. Great timing for control with this species. All right, so here's common teasel. This is a species that unfortunately I found for the first time through a great landowner that we have. Sent me pictures like this, looks out of place, and so was able to pull and hopefully manage the species in our area. But common teasel is definitely an invader of concern in the west. I don't know about its presence as much in the east, but it is a biennial with a large taproot. The leaves in this case for common teasel are opposite and very large, long, and slightly fused at the base. So they're almost connected at the base around the stem. The flowers, as you can see, have these large upcurved spiny bracts that not only are pointy on the end, but also have spines along them. There are spines along the stem, on the midrib of the leaves, and all the way to basically the ground. It has a cone-shaped inflorescence with pink or purple, densely clustered, very small flowers. A couple close-ups of that leaf structure with the opposite leaves and how they almost become entire at the bottom where they're almost connected. You can see the wrinkled surface of the leaves. The outside leaf margin is not exactly smooth. It's not really toothed. It's wavy and really irregular would be the best term I would use for that, really irregular on the rosettes. And you can see the close-up of the flower and how those flower clusters look. I don't know how long it blooms for, as far as how long it stays purple, but I think if you need to identify this plant using those spiny bracts is pretty helpful. So then we move on to cutleaf teasel, which is a bit different. It has a white flower that is densely clustered. Its bracts are thicker. They're not nearly as long or curving as the common teasel we just looked at, and its leaves are opposite and deeply dissect, so really dissect leaves in this case. Here's that same kind of a photo of the leaves where they're opposite on the stem and how dissect they look. Still has lots of prickles all along the stem, on the leaves. And here you can see the dissectedness of the leaf margin, almost lobed in its dissection, and just how different that texture of the leaf and the leaf margin looks between cutleaf teasel and common teasel. Here's a photo I pulled from Chuck's database of kind of what a patch looks like. Very tall plants with most of their biomass in leaves being more towards the base. So that one is cutleaf teasel. It was also a fairly new addition to our weed-free prohibited weed list. So the next plant is Dame's Rocket. And Dame's Rocket is, again, an invasive mustard. It is a short-lived perennial. Kind of seems like this plant just really lives however it wants to. I've seen places where it almost acts more like an annual, then you'll see like a rosette, but very adaptive to situations. The leaves are alternate and they're almost rounded teeth rather than pointy teeth on the plant. Because it's a mustard, it has 4 petals that are bright purple to like a hot pink. Within patches, you can get all variations from very bright pink and purple to almost white. And it is a prolific seed producer. You see it here in the picture with some vegetative Canada thistle. It is an ornamental release, but here you can see the variation in the color of the petals. You can see a little bit more close up in that bottom photo of what the leaf structure looks like, really bright in color, very branching with multiple flowering heads per plant, per stem even. So that is Dame's Rocket. Next we have diffuse snapweed, our first snapweed I think, mini that we'll go through, Centaurea diffuse. Another one of those plants just kind of adapts to the situation it's in. It can be an annual or a biennial or a short-lived perennial, depending on the severity of winter, the insulation it might find where it's invading, and the moisture. These flowers are usually white but can be pinkish to lavender, and the seed bracts have rigid spines. So if you look at that photo, you can see the bracts subtending the petals have these rigid spines coming off of them. The leaves are dissect, and if you think about the dissect plant being like a dandelion, this is even more dissect, more lobed in a sense. I always think of this one as it truly looks weedy. It's not really, the flowers maybe are pretty to some, but not really a pretty growing plant. It could break off at the soil surface and roll to distribute its seeds. Many issues with diffuse snapweed. It's a serious invader in a lot of urban areas just because it can spread so easily. And once again, prickly bracts with white flowers. So here's a couple other photos that have been shared to us. I think these ones from Kelly of some examples of what this looks like in the field. So big and bushy plant here. You can see a close-up here of those spiny tip bracts. They kind of a little bit of dark color on them as well. I think he was putting out some weevils for biological control and got some good photos to share with us. So that is diffuse snapweed. All right, so we move on to another mustard. This is Dyer's woad. It's a biennial plant that we deal with in the West. I'm not sure about its eastern distribution, but a challenging species because it produces a lot of seeds. Typically, if we can manage the seeds on this plant, we can really manage this plant. And so there are many places that have pulling programs for it. It has bright, once again, it's a mustard, so it has 4-petaled, bright yellow flowers that are very small, maybe hundreds, even thousands of actual flowers on the plant in the photo. Its seed pods are black, about a ½ inch long. Each pod contains a seed. This was brought over, as you can maybe guess from its name, they would use the pods for textile dyeing. I think it was actually they turned it blue. But that is Dyer's woad. Its flowers, once again, are borne in the axils. You can see that. They're a very waxy leaf. They're light. Their midvein is white or a really creamy color. And the outside of the leaf, or the leaf margin, is smooth. And so it's got that frosty blue color. A lot of our species, we have one hotspot for this here. It does get this reddish or purple colored stem as it's blooming. I use that to be helpful. We don't have a lot of species that this is confusing with, but if you do need that help, it seems to be pretty consistent. But look for that light colored midvein, kind of that frosty colored leaf, and then of course the bright yellow flowers. Most of its leaf biomass is in the bottom half or maybe even third of the plant, so it gets a lot of flowers at the top and a lot of leaves at the bottom and a fairly naked or less leaved stem, which can be helpful in identification too. If we go back to this photo, see how there's very few leaves that come up the stem towards the flowers. Now we move on to field bindweed. So field bindweed is a significant management challenge if you do have. It is a perennial vining species with creeping rhizomes, really large, woody, very challenging plant to control. The leaves are arrowhead shape. They come to a blunt tip or even a rounded tip. And challenges with this plant is the seed viability is very long and the roots are very long-lived as well. So a couple close-ups. The flowers are a white, soft pink combination. There's 5 petals, but they're all entire, which means they're connected, like in the teacup, together. You can see many plants. So this is typically a vining species unless it comes in contact with a grass or a fence post or a piece of equipment. And then in that case, it will vine up and twist up and become a serious challenge even for walking through or trying to cut it down. And you can see that arrowhead shaped base of the leaf there on a leaf that we pulled off the stem. So that is field bindweed. Here I only deal with it really in kind of disturbance areas along, mostly dealt with our parks and in some lawns, but I know it's a significant management challenge in a lot of the cropping systems that some of you probably deal with more than I. Field scabious, so Nadia. This is a species that I also was first introduced to at the Calgary NAISMA meeting many years ago, and since then have actually found in my county, which is less than desirable, but glad we found it when we did. It's a perennial with a taproot, a very large, significant woody taproot, and the leaves are divided into 3 palmate lobes that are deeply lobed. It has a large light purple flower. Sometimes you'll see varieties of this species in ornamental trade called pincushion. So it's flat on the bottom with all the petals coming off the top, on the top side of the bracts. And the stems can have a reddish purple color as well. So as the leaves move from the bottom of the stem at the basal area up the stem, they become more and more divided. The flower is like a lilac color. It can really be a significant invader, and you can see that in the bottom photo. I know there are some people probably on the call that deal with this species much more than I do, but it is a management challenge in that it does produce a lot of seeds. I feel like we're finally, after about 10 years, getting a hold of our small one field population that we have. But another species that introduction was likely through the ornamental trade. All right, so Horiolisum, this is another species that was recently added. Once again, another mustard. This is a winter annual. If you've been having some moisture this fall, which a lot of us have not, but you'll see rosettes come on this fall. Because it's a mustard, it has 4 dissect petals. You can see in the photo below, it looks like there's 8 actually, because those petals are very dissect. They're very white. I tell this to my crew of 18 to 21-year-olds that it kind of looks like a Q-tip, lots of white tuft on the end of a stem. It can flower throughout the summer. So it starts flowering here in true spring about June and will continue flowering through the fall until it freezes solid. It blooms all summer, which means it's creating seeds all summer. So it has numerous seeds and the stems tend to turn reddish. It's a management challenge because of the prolific seed production as well as its really pubescent nature, in that it's challenging to manage with herbicides because of the almost cobwebby hairs. It's really challenging to have herbicides penetrate that. So you can see those seed pods as I'm talking about. You can see if you visualize it, the like kind of Q-tip idea that I talked about. And then in that bottom photo, you can see those 4 petals that are dissected that more look like 8, almost looks like spider legs, 4 off of each side because of the way that those petals are dissected. And also that reddish to purple colored stem. Nicole was able to get some great photos of that to share with our group up in Alberta. Here's another kind of a patch what it does. We mostly see it on roadsides, even within, like if anybody's done any dirt work on there, even a 2-track going into a field, any dry or gravelly areas within a field, or if any disturbance has been done, but it also seems to be able to sadly invade without disturbance. Like the initial invasion needs a little bit of disturbance, but then it can spread because of its massive seed production. That is Bertaroa. So next we move on to another mustard, in this case a perennial mustard we're dealing with, in hoary cress or white top or cardaria, depending on where you live and what you call it. This is a smaller white flowered mustard. I actually think it's more of a cream petal than a white. If you have a lot of mustards in mind, you might agree with me. It has an extensive horizontal and vertical root system, so really challenging to manage in systems that maybe are tilled because of its perennial nature. It flowers early. It can reproduce once again by those roots and seeds. For identification, a really irregularly looking 4-petaled flower. See how the petals have a irregular format to them and they almost stay closed a little bit at the bottom? They're kind of hard to get a good picture of because they're pretty irregular. And on the other photo, you can see that it has a clasping stem. So if somebody calls me and say, hey, I've had this white thing blooming and it's June, I'm like, okay, so it's got to be a mustard. And then I ask them a few questions. Is the leaves clasping the stem? If you pull it off, does it make an arrowhead? And if they say yes, then in my mind, it's one of 2 species. It's either white top or it's field pennycress. And so in that case, if the soil's loose enough, you can ask them to pull it. And if it breaks off, probably hoary cress, and if it does not, then it's probably another annual mustard, which we aren't concerned with as far as the prohibited weed list. But that's an easy way to pull it down. It also grows in a clumping pattern because of its perennial nature. So here's a couple additional photos of that clumping pattern that it makes. The top photo was a landowner I'd worked with previously who had a bit in his field and decided to refarm it, and then had a lot. And so worked with him to manage that. And it is a species that tends to also grow not only in agricultural systems or rangeland systems, but also in urban areas, alleys, yards that have not been well kept, things like that. Moving on to horse nettle, another species in the Solanaceae family. This particular species is a erect perennial. It has thorns on the leaf stalk and midribs and veins. You can see some of those thorns in this picture. It has a violet or light blue petals, sometimes even going on white in color, with a yellow center. And this species is actually native to the United States. It's more of a problem down in the east and south. I have not dealt with this species here in Wyoming or Colorado where I've lived previously. So some of these photos I've borrowed. You can see the irregular leaf margin. It's more wavy, it comes to a point, but not like a prickle. And then the actual spines or the thorns being more on the stem and on the backside midvein of that leaf. 5 petals, but they are entire and all connected. And so it has that same look, much like henbane had, and the buffalo burr. Very similar species because they're all in the same family. Okay, so then we move on to houndstone, Cynoglossum officinale. Most of us in the West are dealing with this species. I think it's invaded many areas, but it is a rosette, a true rosette, in that it has a group of leaves on the ground the first year, sends up a flowering stalk the second. So not only do you need to look for those flowering plants, but also any rosettes, small rosettes on the ground. The leaves are velvety to the touch, soft. Flowers are dark red to purple in color. The entire plant is covered with a lot of hair. The seeds are born as nutlets, as all plants in the Boraginaceae family are. And the burrs, of course, can attach to hair, jeans, shoelaces, fur of animals. Challenging to manage the seed distribution with this species. When I talk about identification with this plant, it blooms really late here in Pinedale. And so I like to look at the texture and the veination of the leaves. And if you look at that larger photo of the rosette in the bottom corner, you can see the really prominent leaf veination. It almost is alligator skin looking. But one of the things I use for this species with my crew is that the veins almost minimize or diminish before they touch the leaf margin, so the outside of that leaf. If you look at that bottom one, they don't really go all the way to the leaf margin. You can see how fuzzy it is, how hairy it is. It gets that gray kind of color because of the pubescence of the leaves. So that's a helpful thing when you're looking at rosettes, maybe if you're treating or certifying in the beginning part of the year. Typically, what needs disturbance for introduction to a field, so newly worked ditches, maybe pivot, tire tracks, or the sides of pivots would be where I would look. It does like really gravelly areas, so definitely, again, roads, coming into fields, things like that. A very unique color of the flower of houndstone. Some people call it blood red. It's a very purple. And one of the things I talk about with my crews is it smells like pee, or it has a very distinct smell when you go into a patch of it. And they started picking up on that as well when we would go into an area. So it's very stinky in nature as well. A really important species as we talk about plain clean go and cleaning equipment, particularly for us and maybe our canine friends as we go out with those burrs. So the burrs are raindrop shaped. There are 4 nutlets per cluster, and they are all covered with burrs, and you can see how they are shaped like a raindrop. A couple other photos, close-ups of the hairiness and of the rosettes there for houndstone. All right, so this is another grass. We only have a few grasses on our prohibited weed list. This is Johnson grass, or Sorghum halepense. It's a perennial, can grow very tall, up to 8 feet tall. It is born on creeping rhizomes, so really a challenging species to deal with because of the rhizomes. Its stems are solid with prominent nodes. So I have another picture of that, it shows a little bit. And it forms a hypocyanic acid when stressed. So when grazed or stressed, I think also by drought, it can produce these toxic acids. So here's a couple close-ups. You can see the leaf, the auricle, and the hairs there. You can see how tall the plant gets. You can see the reddish purple nature of the open panicle of seed heads, and of course the creeping rhizomes of the roots. So that is Johnson grass. Next we move on to jointed goat grass, which is a winter annual, a challenging annual grass that we deal with out west and in other cropping situations. Its leaves are alternate and can be hairy or smooth. The seed head is cylindrical, so it almost looks like a straw with little pieces left as it's going up. And it can be more than 10 times as long as wide, so long and skinny. And as an annual, has a shallow and fibrous root system. Here you can see when it's green, that kind of really cylindrical shape to the seed head, to the flowering panicle. You can see it has spawns coming off of the glooms on the spike, and you can see the hairy nature of both the leaf and the leaf collar in this instance. Here's an example like this slide because it showed the difference between the jointed goat grass and what maybe more people are familiar with in rangeland situations, the Bromus tinctorum or cheatgrass. So you can see how almost straw-like it is, really cylindrical, doesn't open up like most of our grasses do once it comes out of the root. So next we move on to leafy spurge. Most Western weed managers nemesis in leafy spurge because of its perennial root system. So it is an aggressive rhizomatous perennial plant. The entire plant has a milky latex, which has been known to be an irritant for skin or irritant for livestock if they eat a whole lot of it. The roots can be over 20 foot deep and will have numerous adventitious pink buds off of them. The flowers are small, really tiny. The actual flower is this tiny little spot in the middle. Most of the color comes from the leafy yellow bracts subtend the petals, and it has, I call it like neon yellow color to it. In the fall it turns orange, but in most cases the trick with leafy spurge is that you can have flowering plants and vegetative plants within a patch that are all coming off of the same root system. Here you can see that lime green, lime fluorescent yellow kind of color that the bracts produce, and the needle-like shape of the leaves coming alternate off the stem. It produces seeds that are born in capsules that with dry and heat pop open and shoot the seeds out, 20 feet research shows. So very aggressive, perennial, rhizomatic, noxious weed that we're dealing with. Here you can see the milky latex and kind of how not only the flowers have bracts, but the peduncles or the stem part has this grouping of leaves at the bottom. It almost looks like a little, like an umbrella under that flower. They're called leafy bracts, and those are very helpful in identification if you don't have open flowers or you're there early in the spring. Moving on to another knapweed that we deal with, meadow knapweed. Meadow knapweed is a perennial, can grow up to about 3.5 feet tall. As with most knapweeds, the upper leaves are reduced and the lower leaves are small. The basal leaves are more small and divided. So the leaves are more complex at the base and simplify as they come up the stem. The flowers are large, pinkish purple, and have more of a spotted nature. There are no prickles on the bracts subtending the flowers. As you can see, those really big flower head, big showy purple flower head. As with all knapweeds, both the disc and ray flowers are the same color, so that is helpful in distinguishing it between other asters or erigerons or other species in the aster family. If you are dealing with more of a wild hay situation, that's helpful in identification there. You can see the complexity of the leaf arrangement and the different types of leaves going from very simplistic to really divided on that leaf stem. So that was meadow knapweed. Moving on, Medusa head is another winter annual grass that we deal with. It's long awns. It has a spike with long awns that is nearly as wide as long. If you were to have that open up, it would look fairly equal. The glooms persist on the flower head through the winter, so all of the flower parts don't dehiss or fall off. Of course, it has a bristly, spiky head, and the spikelets are twisted, have twisted awns that can be up to 4 inches long. The leaves are rolled and the sheath is open. So the leaves roll up on themselves, which is helpful in identification maybe before the flower heads are present. Here's an example of the awn, and has some little teeth on it coming off the plant. You can see when I say that the spikelet is almost as wide as it is long. And here you can see the open sheath, which is the area when the leaf comes off of the stem. You can see how open that is. Sometimes they're closed where it's really tight. Sometimes they flatten out. As far as grass terminology, there's a whole separate book on that. This is what Medusa head can do to western rangelands. It's a big concern, maybe on those areas adjacent to fields or with disturbance next to those fields, increasing fire danger, which we're all aware of right now in western rangelands, and definitely it could be a seed issue with some of our forage crops as we're trying to certify, and particularly if there happened to be a gravel pit in area, there'd be a big concern there as well. So that is Medusa head. Next, we move to musk thistle. Musk thistle is a biennial or winter annual thistle. It can be up to 7 feet tall. I've seen them taller than that if the conditions are right. The flowers are borne on nodding stalks. So some people call this nodding thistle, or they actually like tip over because of the weight of the thistle. The flowers are large. They're 1.5 to about 3 inches wide, and they have more of a leafy bract, which you'll see in a second, that hardens and dries almost like pine cone-ish, that subtend the petals, and it can produce up to 200,000 seeds per plant with 90% viability. So really managing the seeds of this plant can help us manage the species. So a couple photos. Here's good shots of the growth habitat, and you can see what I'm talking about when I say large bracts that almost become semi-woody or almost like pine cone-ish if you think about how pokey they are. They do get this reddish color sometimes, and that's helpful. Sometimes they're really flattened out. It just depends, I think, more on moisture with those species. And then up at the top, you see a rosette. And so as this plant being an annual, they're always often in patches, a lot of rosettes. And I like to use this because we have a lot of native thistles too that we all deal with. If you look at a rosette of musk thistle, not only does it have a light colored midvein, but around the outside as the edge of the leaf, you can see that kind of silvery tinge, almost like there's a little frost on there. There's actually a silvery tinge. So if a thistle that you see is a rosette and it has a light colored midvein and that silvery tinge with just spikes or thorns on the outside, likely would be a musk thistle in that situation. So very bright colored in nature that you can see there. So then we move on to orange hawkweed. I think this is the only orange plant we deal with, so it should be pretty easy. Mostly there's not a whole lot of truly orange flowers in North America, but orange hawkweed is perennial, can grow only about 12 inches tall. Its leaves are all basal and lance-shaped and very hairy. The entire plant, as most hawkweeds, contains a milky latex or milky juice. And in this particular species, it has black dots at the base of the hair where it attaches to the stem. So orange flower, very hairy, milky latex. And then you can see, once again, in the aster family, that orange nature. Orange hawkweed can be stoloniferous, so you could see above ground stolons with it. Really challenging to get a good picture of the hair, but you can see on this picture how hairy those are and how black kind of the stem is because of the amount of hair there. All right, so then we move on to oxeye daisy, another pretty flower that we deal with, another ornamental release. It's still even planted in a lot of mountain locations. Unfortunately, you can purchase the seed and plant it. Oxeye daisy is a perennial. Its lower leaves are 2 to 5 inches long. Upper leaves are attached directly to the stem, and the leaf margins are very toothed. The flowers are 1.5 inches wide, and the white ray flowers with yellow disc flowers at the center. They typically are arranged orderly, so they're like, if you were to draw a daisy, this is what it would look like, very much organized in the way the petals come off, and numerous petals per stem. That's what I'm saying, when they're organized nice, it looks very typical. There's not a whole lot of holes or gaps, although they might be directly in order like a picket fence. It still looks very nice. We'll talk about a species here in a little bit that is different than that. You can see the tooth margin of the leaves and the bud of the flower. Oxeye daisy likes sub-irrigated meadows that I deal with a lot. It also likes disturbed areas, so you could have it both in gravel areas and in probably in mulch and forage. So something to look for in all three of our programs. Here's a photo of it in a hayfield, how it looks. So it's a clumping perennial. So history on this photo is this landowner came to us, hey, I have a little bit. They didn't want to boom the field, and so they hayed it and spread the seed, and now they have a pretty much continuous crop. But it spreads rhizomatic. If you think of Canada thistle, basically eventually the population gets so heavy, the clumps all merge together, and that's what makes this more of a white patch there. Extensive seed producers because of it being an aster family. All right, so then we move on to perennial pepperweed. So another perennial mustard that we deal with. It's fairly erect in its nature. It's a perennial with a clumping root system. It spreads by seeds and those deep-seated roots. The flowers are a snow white, very small 4-petaled flower, densely clustered at the tip of each stem. And most of the leaves on the stem are long and pointed, but the basal leaves are much larger and wider and almost triangular shaped or rounded. So in our area, it looks very similar to a cottonwood tree, the base, and we use that to describe that to our crews each summer. So you can see the basal sprouting plant coming off the rootstock. The background photo there is a huge population we dealt with here along the Green River. Those plants were about 6 foot tall and so thick you couldn't walk through it. And then if you pulled them back, you could find these small young plants underneath them. You can see the leaves as they're coming off. They have a long petiole before the thicker part of the leaf starts. And they do have a wavy, some places it's a little bit of tooth, but very irregular leaf margin on the plants. And fairly waxy also, but snow white, very small 4-petaled flowers. So that is perennial pepperweed. This is a population I've dealt with in a drier area. So these plants in a dry area may only grow to about 3 feet, while in a wet meadow, maybe they could be 6 feet tall and a little less dense in dry areas. It's suited for both of those situations. All right, moving on to perennial sow thistles. So I describe this as dandelion on steroids. If you look at the flower, it is a perennial spreading from horizontal roots and its seeds. The stems are hollow between the joints and have a milky, juicy latex, but the flowers are flat-topped. And in our area, they tend to bloom late summer. So like in August, it's much later in the year than a lot of other aster plants. So while it doesn't necessarily have prickles like a thistle, the leaf margin has these protrusions that kind of turn into a spike. And you can see that on the photo there, where they turn into more of a poke, or not even really a bristle, but they turn into a sharp point at the end. You can see that flat flower. And there are some native species of sow thistle in our area. And one thing that I use to distinguish those is if you look at the large photo there, you can see the bud turns more of a cone shape. It doesn't have a point like some other yellow flowered aster species can. It kind of is more like a cone, and I use that as a helpful description as we're mostly doing our management treatments with this species before it actually blooms, because it blooms so late in the year. So it does have a lighter colored base to the leaf and a very green top and a white or frosty silvered colored base. That's also very helpful in identification. So that is perennial sow thistle. Then we move on to plumeless thistle, another thistle we deal with. If you look at this thistle, you can see how its bracts differentiate from the other thistles we've talked about. They are smaller and very spiny, bright purple flowers. The stems of plumeless thistle are winged with spines coming off the stem. They can be about 4 feet tall, bright purple flower heads that are only about 1/2 to 1 inch. So a smaller flower head than musk thistle, but larger than Canada. Plants can grow significantly taller in certain situations, and you can see that ball subtending the petal is almost a true ball. It's very round, and then the petals come out of the top there. And very helpful, and probably most helpful identification characteristic for plumeless thistle is the winged, very bright green stem. Then we move on to poison hemlock, Conium maculatum, which is a poisonous plant as described. It is a biennial, can grow very tall, up to 10 feet, grows in a lot of different situations, but does like water. Its stems have purple spots with distinct ridges along the stem. The flowers are tiny and clustered at the top of the plant in these big, almost plate-like inflorescences. And the leaves are very delicate looking, lacy or fern-like. And of course, all parts of this plant are poisonous. It's very bright green in color. So here's a close-up of the flower. So you see the multiple clusters, and then they're all clustered together almost to form a plate. You can see the lacy and delicate leaves, and then on the bottom photo, you can see those ridged stems with the purple spots on it. That's very helpful for identification. If you were to just see it really young, it would look more like that top photo where it's just lacy and bright green, and it does tend to come up really early in the first of spring. So that's poison hemlock. Now we move on to puncture vine. Puncture vine is an annual mat-fording species that we deal with. They can have trailing stems over 5 feet long. There's a lot of stem area that's not covered with leaves. If you were to look at that bottom picture there, it has a 5-petaled yellow flower, and its leaves are opposite as they come off of that stem. Its seed capsule has 2 sharp spines resembling a goat head. Some close-up photos of that. You can see the leaves coming off. They're divided and pinnately compound. The 5-petaled flower that's yellow. You can see the goat head as dried and also in its green form. So a vining species we deal with, some in urban areas, but a lot of agricultural fields, roadways, ditches, fallow areas on the sides of fields, and definitely would be dealing with that in gravel pit areas with the disturbance. Okay, so then we move to purple loosestrife. So purple loosestrife, as many of you know, is a perennial. It can grow up to 8 feet tall. It has rosy purple flowers with 5 to 7 wrinkled petals. So the petals, when it says wrinkled, I'd like to best describe that if you took a piece of paper and wrinkled it all up in your fist and then let it go, if you were to look at the petals of purple loosestrife, they would still look wrinkly like a sheet of paper. Its leaves are opposite or whorled. Opposite is where they're coming off across from each other on the stem, and whorled is where more than 2 or 3, sometimes even more on purple loosestrife, are coming off at one point along the stem. It's adopted to aquatic sites, so you would only probably see that in hayfields along ditches or storage facilities for water. Differentiates in its habitat type that you would find it in the field. Significant species in the ornamental trade, so some of us deal with it in that capacity within our jobs, but a bright purple, beautiful colored flower that is brought in the ornamental trade. And quackgrass is a challenging species to identify because we have so many improved varieties of wheatgrasses in our agronomic situations. And so quackgrass is an erect perennial grass. It's best known for its rhizomes. Anybody that deals with this species just despises the white rhizomes that come off of it. They're sharp pointed and rooting, and they have a lot of nodes where those rhizomes will come off of the root system. Roots are said to penetrate hard soil surfaces, and they can make little tubers above their plants where they'll go in because the tip of that rhizome is so sharp and pointy. It is a wheatgrass species, so it looks similar in its seed head to a lot of other wheatgrasses, where it has short awnds coming off of the glumes and lemmas, and it has a open leaf, a flat leaf with ribs on it, best identified by its root system. And in a lot of cases, I like to look at, if I have some dry hay I'm looking at, if you look at the hairs at the base of the stem right before it goes in the ground, if there's a lot of hairs there, it will tend to be quackgrass, but definitely a challenge species for identification in other wheatgrass forage crops. Then we move on to rush skeleton weed, another aster that we have to deal with. It's a perennial, has basal leaves like a dandelion. The upper leaves on the stem are very inconspicuous or not there. The leaves on the stem tend to be really reduced or absent. The stem bottoms will have 4 to 6 inches, and they'll have the very bottom 4 to 6 inches will have these red downward or rust colored downward bent coarse hairs, and then very small 3/4 of an inch wide yellow flowers on the tops of the plants. So that's what this looks like. You can see these rust colored, very densely collected hairs at the very base of the plant. You see its leaves look a lot like a dandelion. They're a little bit hairy, so that distinguishes them. And then the flower head, because it's in the aster family, has some ray and disc flowers, and they're bright yellow in nature. It does make a seed that is plumose, so in the far bottom photo, you can see a sample that was collected actually in my county by previous supervisor, Adrienne. She collected it to get proper identification, and overnight it went to seed and turned, made all those fluffy seed heads that had to be managed. So here's more of a live look at those hairs on the stem with basal leaves looking like a dandelion, and most of the upper stem being leafless in this case. So we move on to Russian knapweed, another one of our knapweeds. This one is a perennial. It can grow up to 3 feet tall and forms dense colonies coming off of that root system. It has several leaf types. It's another one of those where the leaves are more complex and dissect and irregular along the leaf margin at the base, and then as they come up the stem, they turn more needle-like and more linear. The flowers are lavender and sometimes can be a creamy color and more shaped like what we typically think of Canada with the scaly leaf bracts. So here you can see the bracts subtending the petal are green and leafy. They would be soft to the touch. There's no bristles or pokes on them. Here's an example of the really irregular leaf margin, the basal leaves of Russian knapweed. It is a very pubescent, it's covered in hairs. And then you could see a dense colony in the other photo there, situation where we were dealing with a dense colony of knapweed just off of a meadow actually that we certified. So very challenging, has some toxic properties in relation to if it was fed to horses, just like yellow star thistle does. All right, so here's scentless chamomile. Scentless chamomile is one of those species that kind of does what it pleases. It can be an annual or a biennial. In some cases, it can overwinter and become a perennial. Its leaves are very divided, kind of lacy and dainty, and it has white daisy-like flowers with yellow disc flowers in the center and white ray flowers on the outside. And it is very similar to mayweed chamomile and other chamomiles, except for scentless chamomile lacks a strong odor that they have. In our area, the stems are purple, and that's very helpful. I think it's easy to identify with those purple stems, and then the leaves are dainty and lacy. It doesn't grow super tall here. And if you go back to when I was talking about oxeye daisy, when you look at the flowers of chamomile, they're more irregular. They're less like not perfect. So some petals will be missing, some petals will be crossing each other. It tends to grow a little less organized, if that makes sense to you. But you can see the lacy nature. You can see in the photo at the bottom how thick the populations can get. This is following an irrigation ditch through the one field, and then of course the other one would be a situation, it would be on the side of a field or maybe even in a backyard area where there's a lot of chamomile, which produces a lot of seeds for potential spread there. Now we'll go on to Scotch thistle, which those of you that have dealt with Scotch thistle, it's one of the thistles that we deal with. It's really in my area, the only thistle we deal with that's like a gray or frosty in color. It is a biennial, sometimes an annual in good moisture conditions, and it can get really big and really thick, up to 8 feet tall. It has large leaves that are hairy on both sides of the surface that gives it that gray appearance. It has a winged stem, so there's leaves with spines along the stem of this plant, and the flowers are relatively inconspicuous with really light colored violet but spiny bracts. So as we look at a close-up of this, you can see how large and robust the leaves are. But the easiest characteristic, once again, for this species is the gray color combined with the robustness and then the leafy stem. So, or some of the crew call it like a razor blade stem. So it's just kind of a leaf on the stem, but all the spines and pokes are coming off of that. So that is Scotch thistle. The flowers are pretty light colored and the bracts are more of a ball shape. So then we move on to Serratia lespedeza. This is a species that is a perennial legume that we deal with. It's about 5 feet tall and it's drought hardy. I can't remember the whole history, but I think it was brought in as a drought tolerant forage species, and then it started to invade in eastern, more humid rangelands. It has a yellowish white pea flower that dry to yellow, little tinge of purple in there, and the stems have small hairs laying flat along the stem ridges. So it's a very leafy species, almost sub-shrubbish as it grows. And then it has these small pea flowers that are right with the purpley yellow center and very small leaves along them, growing very dense in invasion when it takes over. Extreme forage concern in more humid areas of the United States. In fact, I think it's burned for management to freshen it up, and then some livestock will eat it. But so that's Serratia lespedeza. Okay, so then we move to spotted knapweed. So spotted knapweed is an EDRR species in my county that we deal with a lot, and of course best identified by its spots. So it's a biennial or short-lived perennial. It's bright pink to purple, almost a neon pink when it blooms here in the summertime. And its bracts have dark spots on them. It's very aggressive in producing a lot of seeds. It can vest large areas quickly and has very little, if any, forage value, or is it really typically grazed. So here you can see the really divided leaf nature in both the rosettes and the leaves growing on the stem. Because it's a knapweed, there's no difference in color between the ray and disc flowers in the flower heads. And you can even see the spots on the bracts in the skeleton flowers. So a hard plant to get a good picture of the leaves, but you can see how dissect and gray colored they are there. This is a very robust plant that we had a picture of. You can see the dozens of flowers on that plant growing off of one taprooted stem. And as most knapweeds, divided and complex leaves at the base, and as those leaves go up the stem towards the flowers, they become much more reduced and linear, but frosty gray in this case. Okay, so then we have square root knapweed, another knapweed we deal with that's a perennial. Its leaves are also covered in a fine hair, and the lower leaves are deeply dissect and the upper leaves are more bract. You can see that divided leaf there in the lower picture. It has a very entangled growth form, and here is the bracts of the square-o snapweed. It's more of a long skinny bract with the spinose tip, and then the pink flowers coming out the top differentiates it from diffuse snapweed that has the cream or really light pink flowers. So that was square-o snapweed. Now we move to common St. John's wort. So common St. John's wort is a perennial species, was introduced for homeopathic purposes and has spread into many forested situations and invasions. Its leaves are opposite and attached directly to the stem, so it doesn't have a leaf petiole or a leaf stem. They're attached directly to the stem. The leaves are unique. Some of you people that deal with this species, if you were to hold it up, it has little spots, like it has little holes in it, transparent dots. The flowers are 5-petaled and with numerous stamens, and the seeds are small and rough. So here you can see a close-up of the flower with the bright yellow flowers and the numerous stamens. You can see when I was talking about the little holes in the leaf, those are very apparent in that picture in hand when you see it out. And it's more of a subshrub or a bushy species. It can have single stems, but it can grow quite thick. So that is common St. John's wort. Now we move to sulfur cinquefoil. Sulfur cinquefoil is a long-lived perennial. It has palmate compound leaves. So the leaves radiate from a center point, just like your hand, and they'll have 5 to 7 leaflets, which is really important. And they're covered in coarse, stiff hairs, as are the stems, or are the flower buds. All parts of this plant are covered in hairs. And the flower petals are pale yellow or sulfur or butter colored with 5 petals. So there are many native cinquefoils, and we deal with a lot of them when we're certifying hay. So the important designation for this species is the sulfur or light yellow colored flowers, the 5 to 7 palmate, the compound leaves, and then the abundance of hair. So here's some photos of the hair, the sulfur colored flowers, the 5 to 7 palmately compound leaves. You can see the hairs not only are on the stem and the backside of the leaves, but they're all over the bracts subtending the petals and the sepals. So very hairy with the naked eye even. This is what it looks like in a patch. I've seen it in both wet and dry areas, and it grows more erect than a lot of where the leaves there'll be more leaves on the stem than a lot of our native cinquefoils. In my area, at least, we have hundreds of cinquefoils. We only have a few that have sulfur colored flowers, and of those, none of them have palmate leaves. They have pinnately compound leaves. So that is helpful in being able to distinguish this sulfur cinquefoil invader from the many native cinquefoils we have in our area. Okay, so then we move to tall buttercup. Tall buttercup is a hairy perennial. It grows about 3 feet tall, mostly in sub-irrigated or wet meadows. The lower leaves are 3 to 5 lobed, and the upper leaves will be lobed, but they'll also have 3 to 4 kind of segments where they branch off. The flowers are bright yellow and 5-petaled, and like I said, can become very prolific in meadows and can be poisonous just like other buttercups or ranunculus. There's some of this in Wyoming, but a lot of the research on tall buttercup is actually coming out of Montana right now. So here you can see the divisions or the prolific lobes of the leaves of tall buttercup. As most buttercups, because it's in the rose family, has lots of male parts on the interior of the flower, but those 5 bright petals, and it can grow relatively tall in a meadow, but usually likes wet areas. So that's tall buttercup. You can see how prolific it has become in this meadow. Okay, so then we move to tansy ragwort. It's a senecio that we deal with in forage situations as a noxious weed in several western states. So tansy ragwort is a biennial or short-lived perennial. It reproduces by seed only, so it doesn't have those nasty root systems that we deal with on a lot of other plants. Its leaves are deeply lobed and bright green in color, and like a lot of senecios, it can be toxic to cattle, horses, and causing diseases in the liver and increased of mostly white-faced animals in their sensitivity to the sun, photosynthesization, which is caused by senecios in general. So here's some photos of tansy ragwort. I don't know if it still is, but more prolific, and I borrowed these folks from our counterparts up in Montana. You can see its weedy nature there. It's a true aster senecio, so it has both yellow, ray, and disc petals, many flowers at the top of the plant. And in Montana, the bottom photo there is the biocontrol that they've been using on it with pretty good success. One of those species that's a success story, but we definitely don't want to be moving it around in any of our products. So that is tansy ragwort. Okay, so then we move on to Viper's bug loss, or blueweed. It's a annual, biennial, perennial, one of those species that kind of adapts to the weather conditions of that year. Its leaves are alternate in lance shape and covered in bristly hairs with a swollen base that is a rust or brown color. The flowers are what's called a fiddle neck, so they start at the base and they'll untwine and bloom these bright purple or neon purple flower color, and they have a large taproot. So this is Viper's bug loss. Here you can see at the base of the hairs on the stem these spots, these rust or reddish or brown colored spots. You can see the fiddle head kind of appearance of the flower head with the really unique bluish purple colored petals and the more kind of a pink or red colored stamens, which are always exerted from the length of the petal. The other photo you can see, it's almost like it looks like the leaf surface is blistered or has pustule would be the term in dichotomous pustuled leaf surface. Most likely there's hairs coming off the top of those pustules, but it almost looks like it has blisters all over it. This is a plant you do not want to handle with the naked hand. Those hairs come up and can be very irritant to the skin, but very unique flower color, very hairy, really invasive in disturbed areas, and then it gets its foothold and can go from there. In Wyoming, we're dealing with it a lot on our trans-state railroad, unfortunately. So Viper's bug loss, or blueweed. And then we go to wild oats. So wild oats are an annual grass. They're a seedling. The seedlings have a twisted leaf that twists counterclockwise, very specific in the direction it twists. The seeds have awns that also are twisted and bent to form right angles at maturity. And it's a serious problem in a lot of our grain crops. So maybe some of those producers that are looking to produce some straw and other grain crops, this would be a weed that you're dealing with there. So wild oat, you can see the twisted leaf in the bottom picture with the red background. You can see the typical oat and twisted. You can see the twistedness of the awn there. And then you can see the large open panicle and open sheath of the leaf where it overlaps. I borrowed some of these photos from Matt Levin. He's a professor up in Utah and takes incredible plant photos that he's allowed us to borrow for educational purposes. So a huge thanks to him on some of these species I don't deal with so much. All right, so then we move to another grass. This is wild proso millet, Panicum millicum. It's an annual grass. The leaf sheaths have long hairs. The flowers are a panicle that can be quite large, 6 to 12 inches wide, often not fully extended. So that means some of it will stay down in the sheath, wrapped up in that top of the leaf or the top of the stem. And the seeds are smooth, they're oval, and they're dark brown to black in color. Very wide leaves, very large panicles with fairly large seeds on wild proso millet. Couple more photos. This is another one if anybody has any helpful hints. Very wide leaf that's quite hairy, a hairy auricle where the leaf pulls away from the stem. And then the glooms have the glooms are the outer protective leaf capsule or bract that covers up the flowering head in grasses. And you can see in that picture how they have a striped venation on them. That can be helpful in separating that from other species, but pretty showy as far as a grass goes. All right, so then we move to our other blue stem that was added a few years ago. This is yellow blue stem. It is also a warm season blue-gray bunchgrass. Its flowering stems can be up to 4 feet tall. It has a yellow-green leaves that are usually smooth. The leaves can grow up to 10 inches in length. So long leaves on this plant. The leaf blades are flat or folded, so they can be folded on each other or open flat. The silvery reddish purple flower head is similar to that of big blue stem, except that there are more branches and they are much finer with smaller seeds. In the photo there, you can see how long and small the seed heads are in this yellow-blue stem. It blooms late in June and July, which is earlier than most of the native blue stems. And it also turns straw or light colored in the fall, rather than native blue stems that turn red to purple. So a couple of photos of it, you can see the length and extension with, even though they're smaller seed heads, the entire inflorescence is longer on those branches. You can see that it has a red head, but the leaves and stems are more yellow in color, and that's yellow blue stem. So then we move to yellow hawkweed. So yellow hawkweed is another perennial. Its leaves are hairy and basal with an occasional leaf up the stem. As hawkweeds in the hierarchium, it has a milky latex within, smaller yellow flowers bunched towards the top of the plant with roundish pointed buds. You can see the basal leaves that are small, mostly elliptical and hairy, and then the flowers there, small, more than one clustered at the top of the plant. Now we move to yellow star thistle. So yellow star thistle is an annual. It's one of those ones that's of the worst that we deal with. The leaves are basal and lobed like a dandelion, but the upper leaves, once again, like a lot of knapweeds, are small, come to a point, much reduced, very linear. The flower bracts are tipped with these straw-colored thorns. It's one of those things you just can't forget about, those thorns. And once again, yellow star thistle can cause chewing disease in horses, which is a disease that disrupts the neurological platform, and basically they forget how to eat, and animals actually starve to death in that fashion. Very challenging species to deal with. You can see the much branched frosty colored leaves, much like a dandelion, the bright yellow petal tuft subtended by thorn bracts, the really reduced leaves on the stem, and of course those thorns. If any of you happened to travel a few years ago, like 10 years ago maybe, to the Pueblo NAISMA meeting, we actually went out to view a patch of yellow star thistle, and some of these photos are from that day in Colorado. Then we move to yellow toadflax. So yellow toadflax is another perennial noxious weed that we deal with. Its leaves are long, linear, and smooth, and come to a point, but not a prickly point. The flowers are yellow with a 1 to 1.5 inch spur off the base, and yellow toadflax is spread by seeds or roots. In ornamental trade, it's called butter and eggs. It is a very aggressive invader. Here you can see the linear leaves, the kind of two-tone flower, and the long spur that comes off the bottom of them. When you think about yellow toadflax versus Dalmatian toadflax, yellow toadflax's flowers are much more clustered tightly and towards the top of the plant. Of course, there's heart-shaped leaves and narrow leaves in yellow toadflax versus the heart-shaped leaves of Dalmatian. And it is definitely a species to watch for in irrigated meadows. You can see the really young, narrow leaves that we have. You can see the kind of crossed boundary fence issue here, and then of course if you look at the top picture there, that's big clump of yellow toadflax is likely all coming off of the same woody root system. It's a really challenging plant to manage. In my area, it's one of our top species for management on our forested lands and on our public lands, although we do have small populations of it in town in older homesteads and historical cemeteries and flower beds. That is yellow toadflax. That is all of our species. Thanks to everybody on the committee or friends through the association that have helped me gather and sent photos.
Thank you, Julie.